Every once in a while, we see a bit of news, a bit of research evidence that appears about how closely Neanderthals resembled human beings. The most recent example I know of is that it turns out that they had a much more developed speech capacity than we had thought. And perhaps one of the most interesting aspects, or the most interesting clues to their close kinship to human beings, and the most discussed, is how they used to bury their dead. Because they would use burial sites, they would strew in patterned and deliberate ways flowers around the bodies of the dead. There would be personal belongings and other things included in the graves, which perhaps had meaning to the dead during life. And I guess it's not too surprising that we would seek to measure this our sort of affinity to Neanderthals along this line of behavior, because of course it's something that human societies have always had in common and is reflected still in the many different ways in which we honor and remember our dead. Not a morbid interest, but rather an indication of how much value we place on life and how much we mourn its loss. Now, unfortunately, there are other much less admirable characteristics of we human beings, and that is our readiness to resort to violence to settle our differences. And so wars have given us many more occasions and reasons to bury our dead and to try and remember those lives lost as best we can through cultural artifacts such as war memorials. And today, in the age of the web, these are not just monuments of stone, but they are also websites with names like Faces of the Fallen that record the war dead, and with photographs, with life stories and biographies, and often incorporating testimonials and the memories of those who knew them and grieve for them now. And we also do this for civilians killed in acts of mass violence. And so we have memorials for the terrorist attacks that have occurred both in London and in other parts of the world. Obviously, a primary example is the amazing memorials to the victims of who were killed in the World Trade Center. But what about the many more civilians and combatants who are killed in wars and acts of violence across the world, in lands beyond our borders, yet in lands often where our militaries have been one of the causes of their death, or where our military interventions have ultimately led to civil conflict and so on, as we see, for example, in Iraq? Well, in a little noticed remark, General Tommy Franks in 2002 said to the press, and Tommy Franks had just led the invasion of Afghanistan and was later to lead, in 2003, to lead the invasion of Iraq. And he said, "We don't do body counts." And that phrase, by which he was actually trying to say something positive, he was trying to say that he didn't measure military success by the number of enemy killed, actually also applies to the way that his military was not recording civilian deaths either. And in fact, after the invasion of Iraq, one of his officers incredibly said that the military did not try to record Iraqi civilian casualties because they were not targeting them. Whether they would just be collateral damage in that infamous phrase. And just as incredibly, Britain's defense minister around the same time said that because he believed that coalition forces had done everything to prevent unnecessary casualties, his government did not propose to have any kind of formal review of casualties that Iraqis may have sustained. Well, the Iraq Body Count Project is a project that we set up partly in response to what we think is a complete dereliction of duty in this regard. And I think it's been a successful challenge. We began in early 2003, in fact, just slightly before the invasion, and since that time we've been recording in as much detail as possible every scrap of information and with as much rigor as possible that concerns Iraqi civilian deaths and more recently also combatant deaths. The circumstances of the death, the time, the date, the location where people were killed, the kinds of weapons they were killed by, and also, very importantly, what is known about the victims themselves, their demographics, and wherever possible, and that's only possible in a minority of cases so far, their identity, their names, who they were. And I say it was a successful challenge because the greatest objection that was raised to our project at the beginning was that this kind of work was actually impossible, that it couldn't be done in the fog of war, who knew what was going on, and it just wasn't possible to record casualties in any kind of reliable fashion. And yet we showed that it actually could be done. And the irony of it is that before very long, in fact within less than a year, the very same people who had expressed their skepticism and more or less poo-pooed everything we were doing were using our statistics whenever they had to talk about Iraqi civilians killed as a result of the invasion. And that includes people that, who you would think would be quite disinclined to mention Iraqi civilian deaths, as well as people who might have more reason to do so. And I think the reason for that is that we made it impossible for anyone to talk at length about the Iraq conflict without eventually having to face some facts that our project had very much put on the table, as it were, and made public and visible. So in the course of this time, we've had people ultimately, including Tony Blair, George W. Bush, which amazed us, and perhaps a little less surprisingly, Osama bin Laden mention our figures during the course of time. Well, of course, during this time, we managed to show that it could be done, but one of the main problems that we still face is that the information that we produce there's no sort of corollary to it that's coming from states. The uses that were made by people like Tony Blair or George W. Bush and so on, or Osama bin Laden indeed, were fleeting, just fleeting mentions. But at the same time, we've had much more serious use made by bodies such as the World Health Organization and other UN bodies and institutions, and even people like the IMF and World Bank and so on, things that we hadn't really anticipated. And it was also being used by civil society organizations, by humanitarian organizations working in Iraq, or also by the likes of campaign groups who are trying to effect the ban of various kinds of weapons, which inevitably lead to civilian casualties, such as, for example, the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. And this information has been used by this wide range of users, let's say, end users, because it was reliable insofar as it was disaggregated information, so people would see the raw data on which our information was based, and we made it accessible, we published it online, and a lot of times, people would only discover later that some of these very sort of important institutions had made sometimes very important use of it, such as, for example, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, having used it to provide advice to host countries on whether or not Iraqis could safely be returned Iraqi asylum seekers could safely be returned to their country, and recommending that they shouldn't be. The other way in which we found that our information has been useful, though, is on a very different nature. And that relates to the fact that it's also a kind of respectful record. Because statistics are important, and our statistics got a lot of use. But the main thing that we're attempting to do is to actually create a list of the Iraqi dead. That's the individual by individual. When we're talking about human lives that have been lost, we can't just talk about how many, even when there's great masses and numbers of them. We have to talk about who has been killed, and that's the only proper way that we have a real sense of who's gone. And one of the more creditable uses of the work that we've produced and the data that we've published has been in things like public readings of the names of Iraqis killed alongside the names of much better known in our societies of soldiers and so on. And an event that I remember quite fondly, because partly because I was there, but also who else was present, was in Trafalgar Square. And there have been hundreds of events like this, by the way, where Stephen Hawking was present and apologized for the fact that his speech synthesizer hadn't been designed to pronounce Iraqi names properly. This is the kind of humanizing work that governments generally just never tend to do, that is to say, to look at individual deaths. But there are many organizations around the world who actually are doing exactly this kind of work, and most of them are NGOs. And so almost in any conflict around the world at present, there are usually NGOs who are producing information on who's being killed. Of course, there are anonymity issues that are very important, safety issues, security issues that prevent all information being published instantly. But even in the midst of war, there are organizations working in Somalia, in Syria, as is fairly well known, and in the occupied territories. In fact, almost anywhere in the world where there has been recently been conflict, or where there's a conflict ongoing at present. Some of the best work, in fact, having been done in the former Yugoslavia with entire books that contain nothing but names of the dead with their life stories as well. And people from all backgrounds, whether civilian or combatant, and whichever ethnic or national background they had. So this kind of work is possible, and this kind of work goes on, but unfortunately, states are not even supporting this kind of work, even just by facilitating it or funding it or contributing it to themselves, and sometimes they actively get in the way of this kind of work, and that has to change. So I'm also involved in another project, which I co-founded, which is called Every Casualty, and that seeks to ensure that states do play their part to ensure that every single casualty of armed violence around the world is promptly recorded, correctly identified, and publicly acknowledged. In the absence of such work, generally, what we have in the world today is a lot of argument about numbers. And as I've said before, arguments about numbers are surely unsatisfactory. But nowadays, it's not actually necessary only to stick to numbers, because we do live, as we know, in an information age, and we have lived in this age for quite some time. And unless we finally do come to the point where there is no one who dies as a result of violence anywhere in the world without it being properly and duly recorded, then maybe we're not quite yet as human as we like to think we are. On the other hand, if we do manage this, then perhaps one day, and who knows how far in the future, there may come a time when our species looks at these records of lives extinguished, of human dreams shattered, and of human potential lost, and say, this is why we don't do wars anymore. Thank you.